she was already America's sweetheart. He was the charming British underdog. And together, in that little bookshop on Portobello Road, they created one of the most beloved love stories of the 90s. But what no one knew, what Julia Roberts never spoke about for decades, is that Notting Hill wasn't just a movie that changed her career. It changed something else. Something she couldn't name at the time. Now, at 64, Julia has finally admitted it. And what she just revealed about Hugh Grant, and what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling, has left longtime fans in tears. Because for all the laughter, the chemistry, the awkward smiles and quiet heartbreak on screen, there was something behind it, and Julia kept it to herself. Until now. In the spring of 1999, audiences fell in love all over again. Notting Hill wasn't just another romantic comedy, it was lightning in a bottle. And much of that magic came down to two people, Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant, who seemed somehow completely real in a world built on fantasy. Julia played Anna Scott, a world-famous actress quietly unraveling beneath the weight of fame. Hugh was William Thacker, the unassuming London bookseller with nothing to offer her except sincerity. On screen, their love story was awkward, vulnerable, and unexpectedly beautiful. But behind the scenes, something deeper was taking shape. At the time, Julia was no stranger to romantic comedies. She'd already headlined Pretty Woman, My Best Friend's Wedding, and Runaway Bride. She was confident, polished, adored. Hugh, on the other hand, was still riding the wave from 4 Weddings and a Funeral. He brought charm, yes, but also nerves. And from the very beginning, Julia noticed it. Their first table read was quiet. Hugh cracked jokes to lighten the mood, but Julia could see through it. He was trying to impress her, and oddly enough, she found herself doing the same. There was no obvious spark, at least not at first. But there was something unusual. They listened to each other. They made space. Hugh, in particular, was generous in ways that caught Julia off guard. He never interrupted, never demanded the spotlight. On set, when a scene was struggling, he'd look at her, not the director, as if silently asking, "What do you need from me?" Julia later admitted that she found this rare. She'd worked with leading men before. Some had been kind, some distant. But Hugh made her feel safe, like she could try anything and he'd be there to catch her if it didn't land. Still, neither of them crossed the line. There were no tabloid photos, no scandal, they were just co-stars. At least, that's what everyone thought. But as filming went on, crew members began to notice something. Between takes, Julia and Hugh lingered. Their conversations didn't stop when the cameras did. They'd stand in the doorway of a set, sipping coffee, heads tilted toward each other, like there was always one more thing to say. Years later, one crew member described their bond as quiet but undeniable. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it mattered. And the more emotionally charged the scenes became, the park bench, the press conference, that final shot at the bookshop, the more personal it all started to feel. Still, they kept their distance. Julia was dating someone else at the time. Hugh had his own relationships, his own reasons to be careful. And both of them were too professional to let anything jeopardize the film. But something had shifted. Julia later admitted she carried it with her long after filming wrapped, and while she never said it outright, those closest to her noticed. There was a softness when she spoke about Notting Hill, a quiet ache when Hugh's name came up. For years, she stayed silent, out of respect, out of caution, maybe even out of fear of misremembering it all. But now, at 64, she's telling a different story. And what she just said about that moment with Hugh, the one they both tried to forget, changes everything. There's one moment in Notting Hill that fans always come back to. It's not the kiss, or the travel montage, or even the now iconic "I'm just a girl" speech. It's the scene at the press conference when Hugh's character, William, finally asks the question everyone's been holding their breath for. In the film, it plays like closure. But in real life, that moment marked something else entirely. Something Julia didn't talk about for over 2 decades. The truth is, They had to shoot that scene more times than anyone expected. Not because of lighting issues, not because of camera angles, but because Julia kept breaking. She couldn't get through the lines without her voice catching. At one point, the director even asked if she wanted to take a break. She shook her head. Number. She wanted to keep going. What no one realized at the time, what even Hugh didn't fully understand, was that the emotion coming through wasn't just acting. It wasn't about Anna and William anymore. It was about Julia and Hugh. Years later, Julia would say something that fans are still unpacking. She said that scene was the hardest and most honest moment I'd ever played on screen. Because the words weren't just from the script. There had been a conversation between them, just days earlier. One that took place late at night, after filming had wrapped for the day. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even clear what either of them was trying to say. But the undercurrent was there. Julia had asked him, in a roundabout way, what he would have done if they'd met under different circumstances. Not as co-stars, not on a set, but as themselves. Hugh had smiled. He'd said something clever, but then he'd gone quiet. And Julia knew in that silence that they both understood the answer. Timing had never been on their side. And maybe that's why Notting Hill felt so real, because for once, fiction came close to the truth. The press conference scene became a kind of goodbye. Not a dramatic one, not a tearful farewell, but a quiet letting go. Julia delivered the lines, but her eyes did most of the work. And when Hugh looked at her, something in him softened, just for a moment, as if he felt it too. The crew never forgot that day. Some whispered that the mood on set had shifted after the scene. Julia became more introspective, Hugh more reserved. They still laughed and performed and hit every mark, but something unspoken had passed between them. And when the film wrapped a few weeks later, there was no big send-off between the two. Just a long hug. And the kind of look you only give someone when you know it's the last time you'll stand that close. They went their separate ways. Different countries, different projects, different lives. But Julia carried it with her, not as regret exactly, but as something she couldn't quite put into words. Because what she just said about what really happened that day, that one small exchange no one saw, adds a layer to Notting Hill that fans never imagined. And Hugh? He finally broke his silence too. What he admitted next changed everything. For years, Hugh Grant had a habit of brushing things off, especially when it came to romance, especially when it came to Julia Roberts. In interviews, he'd tease her about her laugh, her stardom, even her on-screen kiss. Too big, he once joked about her mouth, in that dry British way that made people laugh, but always left a little something unsaid. Julia laughed too, but it never quite felt like the full story. And then, everything changed. In a rare moment of honesty, years after the press cycle had long since died down, Hugh finally dropped the charm. He was asked, point blank, if there had ever been real feelings between them during Notting Hill. This time, he didn't dodge. Instead, he paused. And then he said something that no one expected. There was something about her. You'd have to be mad not to feel it. That was it. No embellishment, no wink to the camera. Just a single sentence that hung in the air, heavier than all the jokes he'd ever told. For fans who'd spent decades wondering who had memorized every glance between them on screen, it was a quiet confirmation that yes, they had felt it too. Julia, for her part, responded days later. She didn't correct him. She didn't deny it. She simply said that Notting Hill had been one of the most personally meaningful films I've ever made. She didn't say why. She didn't have to. The truth was already there. And suddenly, those old scenes looked different. William fumbling through his words, Anna lowering her defenses, both of them circling something fragile and unspoken. It wasn't just good acting. It was familiarity. It was tension. It was the ache of something too complicated to name. What fans didn't know is that after the film wrapped, Hugh sent her a handwritten letter, just a few lines, a thank you, a memory, and something about the way she looked at him when they weren't filming. Julia kept that letter for years. Not because she was in love, but because it reminded her of a time when something almost happened, when life and art got too close. When two people, each famous, each exhausted, found comfort in someone who didn't want anything but the truth. They never pursued it, never risked the friendship. But the silence between them had always said more than words ever could. And now, after all this time, those words are finally starting to surface. But one story still hadn't been told the moment on set that changed Julia's entire view of Hugh. And it wasn't scripted. It happened during a scene most people barely remember. No grand speeches, no kisses, just a quiet exchange in William's bookshop. Anna walks in, unannounced. Hugh's character fumbles. She asks if it's a good time, and he says it is. The scene plays light, awkward. But in real life, something unscripted broke through that day. The cameras were rolling, the crew was watching, but something in Hugh's expression pulled Julia off course. He looked at her not as Anna, not as the famous movie star, but as Julia, and she saw it. Just for a second. She later described the moment as a slip in the scene that wasn't a mistake. She didn't forget her line. She didn't miss a cue. But her delivery cracked, just slightly. Her timing faltered. Hugh didn't flinch. He just stepped closer, looked her in the eyes, and whispered the next line like they were the only two people in the room. When the director called cut, there was silence. Julia didn't speak. Hugh didn't either. But that moment stayed with her not because it was romantic or dramatic or scripted to be memorable, but because it was real, and real was rare. In later years, Julia admitted that the hardest thing about Notting Hill wasn't the pressure of playing a version of herself. It wasn't the schedule or the press or the expectations. It was walking away from someone who had seen her clearly at a time in her life when she wasn't sure she wanted to be seen. Hugh, by contrast, had once described her as impossibly famous and somehow not intimidating at all. But it wasn't until he revisited the film in his later years that he realized what had happened. "She was always fully present," he said in one interview. "Not many people are." That was his version of a love letter, casual, British, understated. But it meant something, especially to Julia, because what happened between them wasn't a relationship. It wasn't even flirtation. It was something more subtle. A connection forged in a fictional world, but real enough to haunt them long after they left it. And while both moved on marriages, families, careers, Notting Hill became a time capsule, not just for fans, but for the two people who lived inside it, if only briefly. Julia kept that unscripted moment to herself for years. But now, at 64, she's finally sharing it. Not to stir rumors, not for publicity, but because it mattered. And what she says next, the one thing she wishes she'd told Hugh before filming ended, might be the most vulnerable truth of all. Looking back, Julia Roberts has been clear about one thing. She never expected Notting Hill to follow her for this long. It wasn't the highest-grossing film of her career. It didn't earn her an Oscar, and yet, it stayed with her in ways even she couldn't explain. Not because of the script, not because of the success, but because of him, Hugh. He wasn't the co-star she expected to connect with. Their rhythms were different. He deflected with humor. She preferred stillness. And yet, there was an ease between them that no one could quite put into words. It was quiet, unspoken, but deeply felt. For years, she left it alone. No confessions, no interviews, no tell-alls. Just one film, frozen in time. But recently, Julia was asked to name the role that lingered most, not in her career, but in her heart. She thought for a moment, then she said it, Anna, because that wasn't just acting. That was all she gave. No explanation, no wink. But for those who'd watched her in that film, who'd seen the way she looked at Hugh Grant when the lines ran out, it was all the confirmation they needed. And then came the part she'd never said before. She admitted that, when filming wrapped, she meant to say something. Just a few words, nothing dramatic, nothing loaded with meaning, just enough to let him know he wasn't invisible to her. that she'd seen the person behind the performance, and that for a moment, maybe longer, he'd meant something more than a scene partner. But the words didn't come, the moment slipped past, and life kept moving. "I wanted to tell him," she said softly. "That I saw him, not the actor, just him." She never did. Not out of fear. Not because she was protecting herself, but because the timing never seemed right. And later, it felt too far gone. When Hugh heard what Julia had finally shared, his reply was simple. "Well," he said with a half-smile, "that would have been nice to hear." Then a pause. One of those lingering silences he's always been known for. But I suppose that's the thing with timing, isn't it? There was no grand reveal, no twist ending. Just two actors, now in their 60s, looking back at a film that caught something real, if only for a moment. And for the fans who'd always believed the story behind the scenes was just as powerful as the one on screen, they were right. In the end, it was never about whether they were in love. It was about recognition, about finding, in the middle of a scripted romance, something unscripted that made them both stop and take notice. Julia saw something in Hugh that no one else had shown her in that moment of her life, and he, in his quiet way, saw her too. They didn't act on it, they didn't speak of it, but they carried it. Through marriages, through years of success, through decades of interviews where they laughed and dodged the real question. And now, all these years later, fans finally know why Notting Hill felt different, why the chemistry felt honest, why the heartbreak on screen didn't feel like acting at all. Because some stories don't need to end in a love affair to mean something lasting. Some just live on in a single look, in an unsent message, in a film that said what they couldn't. For more emotional stories, check out this video.